Over the years, Doctor Who has become famous for its wide, inventive array of terrifying monsters and villains. From the Daleks to the Sontarans, the monsters of Doctor Who are often more exciting than the adventures themselves. The revived era of Doctor Who has seen the return of many iconic villains, such as the Daleks, Cybermen, Ice Warriors and Zygons, amongst many others. It's always nice to see these evil monsters return, but surprisingly enough, it is rare to see a New Who monster return as a main feature of further episodes. Instead, most New Who monsters are relegated to only appearing as cameos in episodes such as The End of Time Part 2 and Face the Raven. As it turns out, New Who seems to have a bit of a monster problem. Doctor Who has always been in touch with its own history and DNA, which is why it has been able to last for so long. It manages to perfectly balance the old, familiar, iconic monsters with new, original monsters. This is good, it's exactly how it needs to be, but outside of a select few, we have yet to see new, standout monsters that return to terrorise the Doctor time and time again. In fact, it could be argued that the Weeping Angels are the only New Who monsters to develop the same kind of brand recognition and longevity as some of the iconic monsters of the original run of the show. Introduced in Series 3's Blink, the Weeping Angels are statue-like creatures only capable of moving whenever they're not being seen, sending their victims back in time and feeding off of their lost future. This gimmick paid off extremely well, with Blink still regarded as one of the greatest episodes of all time. As a result, the Weeping Angels would find themselves cemented in the public consciousness, just as well known as the Daleks and Cybermen of old. When Stephen Moffat, creator of the Weeping Angels, took over the show in 2010, his first series in charge saw the second appearance of the monster, with the Series 5 two-parter The Time of Angels, Flesh and Stone. These two episodes took a completely different approach compared to Blink, with a more action-orientated story rather than pure horror. This secured the Weeping Angels' success because it proved their versatility. Rather than being set on Earth again, the story takes place on an alien planet, with the monsters in a far more aggressive role. This is similar to the Daleks in their first two appearances. In their first appearance, the Daleks were on Skaro, an alien planet where they were small in number but still a threat to the protagonists. Their next appearance, however, changed things dramatically. In Season 2, the Dalek invasion of Earth saw a much larger amount of Daleks invading and occupying Earth. This ups the ante because it capitalises on people's enjoyment of the monster by making them a bigger threat in their second appearance. They were scary enough when they were a small group on their own planet, but now they're an entire army taking over our own planet. Rather than trying to tell the same story again, like most sequels, the Dalek invasion of Earth tries something different, bringing the threat to our very doorstep. After this serial, the Daleks would appear frequently, facing off against every single incarnation of the Doctor, and becoming one of science fiction's most iconic creations. The Weeping Angels saw similar success, albeit on a smaller scale. Whilst not as widely known as the Daleks, the Weeping Angels are still firmly cemented in the public consciousness. Pretty much everyone knows about the Weeping Angels, even if they don't know they're from Doctor Who. This is firmly due to their inventive premise and design, but that's also the reason most of Stephen Moffat's other creations fail to reach the same heights. The problem with a lot of Moffat creations is that despite being brilliant and creative, there is absolutely no way to bring them back into the show. A prime example of this double-edged sword is the gas mask zombies from Series 1. They're horrifying and fantastic, but you literally cannot bring them back, because they only existed as a flaw in the programming of a medical ship. They're not a species or a race, they're literally just one-off monsters that cannot be replicated without copying the same setup. Similarly, the Vashta Narada from Series 4 are incredibly difficult to properly bring back. The Vashta Narada are a piranha-like species that devour anything stepping into the shadows they live in. The Vashta Narada are great, inventive monsters, but there's no way to actually beat them, something the show stresses. In their first and only appearance in the show, they're not defeated or stopped by the Doctor. They just spare him and everyone in the library because the Doctor bargains with them. Admittedly, the Vashta Nerada have appeared in other Doctor Who media since, such as the adventure games and some Big Finish audio stories, but I personally believe they can't come back to the show. Unless some kind of logical weakness can be introduced, you can't tell new stories with them, because it was expressly stated that they're unstoppable.
Daleks, aim for the eye stalk. Sontarans, back of the neck. Vashta Nerada. Run. Just run.
It could be said that Stephen Moffat's time as showrunner was the biggest problem for recurring New Who monsters. During the Moffat era, monsters were often written around the plot, rather than the other way round. This led to the majority of monsters being one-offs that only serve the purpose of the story. They're just there for necessity. Take monsters such as the foretold from Mummy on the Orient Express, for example. Once that story has been told, that's it. It can't be revisited and the monster can't return, because it can't fit into another story. There's nothing wrong with that. Not every Doctor Who monster can return, after all. However, a lot of newer monsters simply aren't memorable enough or distinctive enough to return. As of early 2020, only 2 monsters created during the Moffat era have gone on to return in later episodes. Those were the Silence and the unnamed aliens from the Husbands of River Song and the Return of Dr. Mysterio. Despite their very interesting gimmick and great visual design, the Silence only really existed to serve the wider Series 6 narrative. There isn't much else you can do with them in future episodes, even though they're beloved monsters. This was further enforced by their appearance in the Time of the Doctor, which explains that the Series 6 Silence were actually a rogue sect, rather than being genuinely evil.
The Kavarian chapter broke away. They travel back along your timeline and try to prevent you ever reaching Trenzalore.
On the other hand, the Russell T Davies era spawned a solid pool of potential monsters that could, and would, return. Davies made the Doctor Who universe seem smaller, but in a good way, because it was tighter. The episodes all feel like they take place in the same universe, because you see familiar things such as the face of Bo. Certain monsters have roles in the wider universe, such as the Sisters of Plenitude in New Earth. Take the Judoon, for example. Introduced in Smith & Jones, the Judoon are a thuggish, mercenary-like intergalactic space force who are also talking rhinos. Due to their main defining characteristic being that they're space police, they can crop up in loads of situations, which led to cameo appearances in The Stolen Earth and Face the Raven, along with a main role in Series 12's Fugitive of the Judoon. The Ood are another good example of a monster with good design, along with a role in the wider universe. In all 3 of their appearances, they are featured as a slave race, with their second appearance, Planet of the Ood, exploring how they are created and forced into slavery. This makes it easy to slot them into a story. Just look at their last appearance, the Doctor's wife. The Ood in that is a servant of the main antagonist, which is easily explained because we know they're a slave race. It's no coincidence that the Ood and Judoon are 2 of the only New Who monsters to properly appear multiple times, because they have a simple, defining characteristic justifying their existence. In my opinion, the Sycorax are another good example of a Davies era monster that could come back in the future. They were the main antagonists of the 2005 Christmas special, but we only scratched the surface of their story potential. Even though they are the billionth warrior race introduced in the show, they are more of a primitive, tribal take on the idea, which makes them a bit more interesting and unique. Their defeat in the episode didn't stem from some kind of fatal flaw or gimmick of the character like most other New Who villains. The Sycorax were beaten because the Doctor defeated the leader in a one-on-one duel, followed by their ship being blown up by Torchwood. This means that there are still stories you can tell with the Sycorax, exploring them further and expanding their lore. Maybe we could end up seeing their home planet, for example, where they are a more formidable unit, rather than being a scavenger outfit like in the Christmas Invasion. The Davies era gifted every future Doctor Who writer with an array of monsters with defined roles in the Doctor Who universe, so they can return without much explanation needed. It's just a shame that this gift was never really accepted in the main show after Davies left. The Sarah Jane Adventures had an episode with the Judoon, along with 3 episodes about the Slitheen, so there are clearly new, different stories to tell with these monsters. Introducing these kinds of clear-cut roles in the universe gives them an identity and creates a deep mythology for the show. In New Earth, it is established that the cat people are a nun-like medical race, which means they could easily return in any episode set in space with medical staff. Why then do they not appear in the Saranga Conundrum, an episode set on a medical ship? I understand the idea of distancing yourself from your predecessors in order to form your own identity. That's the main reason we don't see more recurring monsters. But when a showrunner like Russell T Davies creates these universal roles, there's no harm in implementing them in further stories. It doesn't stop you being able to add your own creations to the show. They're not mutually exclusive. The worst part about New Who's monster problem is when monsters are left out of stories that would be perfect for them, instead being replaced with similar, new monsters. Instead of the return of Dr. Mysterio having the unnamed aliens it has, why can't they just be Slitheen? They're almost the exact same design. One of the recent offenders of this is Series 12's Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. This episode features the Skithra, who are basically a B-Tech Rachnos, looking and acting exactly the same. This means the episode misses a golden opportunity to bring back a lesser known villain, which would play into the Davies era idea that the universe is big enough for all of these monsters to exist, but small enough for you to end up running into them again. The Runaway Bride didn't fully explain who or what the Rachnos were, or why the Time Lords had to fight them, so it's actually quite easy to bring them back and expand upon their lore. Their backstory is pretty open-ended. All you need to do is swap out the Queen of the Skithra to be a Rachnos, and for the shape-shifting scorpions to be spiders, and there you go, happy days. There's nothing to say that the Rachnos couldn't occupy the same characteristics as the Skithra, because we only saw one surviving Rachnos. For all we know, the children she referenced in The Runaway Bride could have been shape-shifting hive drones like the scorpions of the Skithra. In the original run of Doctor Who, there were 155 televised stories. When you break down these 155 stories, there are a significant number of villains with more than one major appearance in the original run of the show. Hell, even the Ogrons appear multiple times. So how do New Who stories match up? Well, once you start listing them all off, it all ends up a bit Life of Brian.
Alright, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
But the problem is that most of those monsters aren't nearly as memorable or long-lasting as classic Who villains. Monsters like Cassandra and Robot Santas aren't really on the same level as Sontarans or Ice Warriors, are they? The other big problem is that the New Who villains that do come back usually only appear in 2 total stories. In fact, only the Ood, Silence and Weeping Angels have had major roles in more than 2 stories. I guess you could count the monks from Series 10 too, but that trilogy really shouldn't be officially designated as a 3-parter. I still don't get why they did that. The classic Doctor Who monsters we have come to know and love only became beloved and iconic because we saw them over and over again, each time extending their legacy and making them more important. Most of them were popular enough from their first appearances, so the writers capitalised by bringing them back more often. Apart from the Weeping Angels, this just hasn't happened in New Who, which is hugely disappointing. Having monsters show up for cameo appearances is still good because it builds that bigger universe, but it's nowhere near as special as having newly created monsters return in significant roles. With the Chris Chibnall era of Doctor Who taking a lot of inspiration from the Davies era, maybe we might start to see more recurring New Who monsters. I mean, we've already seen the return of the Judoon, so maybe we'll see more Davies era monsters like the Slitheen come back in the future. But as it stands, there is a shocking lack of familiarity in New Who monsters. The only returning ones are from the original run of the show, hinting that there is alarming lack of faith in the monsters created over the last 15 years. Right now, New Who most certainly does have a monster problem, but what do you think? Does New Who need to bring back more of its original monsters? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.